Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the wonderfully grimy, slightly cursed world of medieval medicine. You know, before antibiotics, before anesthesia, before anyone even washed their hands. Imagine this. You wake up with a mild fever, maybe a sore throat. Today, you'd pop a paracetamol and scroll TikTok under a blanket. But in the 1300s, you'd be bleeding from the arm within the hour, while someone mumbles Latin over your body and calls it healing. We're talking about a time when your barber could also amputate your leg, and when feeling dizzy meant someone was already lighting a candle for your soul. So before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if medieval suffering oddly soothes you. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. I always love seeing where my fellow insomniacs are lurking. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's gentle horror together. Hospitals in the Middle Ages weren't hospitals the way we think of them today. You didn't go there to get better. You went there because, well, your family gave up, or because the priest said you only had a few sins left to confess. See, modern hospitals are full of lights, machines, nurses with warm hands, and people who gently tell you you're dehydrated. Medieval hospitals? They were dim, damp, and mostly just death waiting rooms. Beds were made of straw or splintered wood. If you were lucky, you got a mattress that didn't already have someone's final breath still in it. If you were really lucky, you got a corner near a window, not for the view, but because the smell inside was described by monks as spiritually challenging. There were no doctors in the modern sense. Maybe a monk who once read a Latin manual on humours. Maybe a nun who'd seen 5 other people die that week and figured she knew what to do with a bucket. Instruments weren't cleaned between uses, because why bother? The last guy didn't make it, and frankly, neither would you. In fact, hospitals weren't even meant for healing. They were called hospices, meant to provide care for the poor, the dying, or the socially inconvenient. It was more like medieval Airbnb, but with more moaning and less breakfast. Sometimes, rich folks would donate beds to the hospital in exchange for prayers. Not better equipment, not funding for treatments. Just a bed. So yes, you could die in a sponsored bed that said, "In honor of Sir Reginald the Flatulent." Most of the treatment you'd get was spiritual. You were encouraged to pray. A lot. Repent your sins. Drink some holy water. And maybe have someone rub oil on your feet while whispering comforting things like, "God's plan is mysterious." And if you were contagious, oh, they had a plan for that. It was called putting you in a room and never opening the door again. Isolation was brutal, but effective, at least for the healthy people on the outside. No antibiotics, no painkillers, no hope, just a hallway of quiet coughing, creaking floorboards, and someone in the next bed muttering psalms between fevers. So no, you didn't go to the hospital in medieval times, unless you were either out of options or already halfway gone. Most people stayed home, not because they were brave, but because they knew. Once you crossed that threshold, the next door you'd walk through probably led to a choir of angels and a very confused St. Peter holding a clipboard. If you lived in medieval times and started feeling a bit unwell, a cough, a chill, or maybe that ominous tickle in your throat, you didn't rush to the hospital. You didn't even consider it. You simply stayed home. Because in that world, staying home wasn't avoidance, it was strategy, or, more accurately, resignation. Most people believed that if an illness had come for you, then only God or dumb luck could save you, preferably both. So what did home treatment look like? Well, imagine this. You lie in a small, cold room with a thatched roof that leaks when it rains. Your mattress is stuffed with straw that itches. Someone has draped a scratchy wool blanket over you, and a neighbor has just whispered, "Try not to die at night. It's bad luck." There's no thermometer, no medicine cabinet, no warm tea with lemon, just a candle, a chamber pot, and a wooden bowl of something that might have been soup 3 days ago. If you were lucky, someone brought herbs. If you were unlucky, someone brought leeches. Either way, most of the healing process involved lying still and hoping whatever you had didn't get worse. Prayer was the go-to prescription. Everyone around you prayed. Your family, your neighbors, probably the goat. Not necessarily because they were religious, but because prayer was one of the few things they could do that didn't involve actual bloodletting. You'd be told to rest, but rest in medieval terms meant trying to sleep through a fever while someone outside chopped wood and the pigs wrestled under the floorboards. People believed if you made it past 3 days of illness, you might survive. That was the threshold. Day 4, you were a medical miracle. Day 2.5, someone was already carving a nameplate for your grave, or at least planning who got your remaining shoes. So yes, the most common medieval treatment for illness was waiting, waiting, and hoping, and sweating through it while everyone around you quietly debated whether to call the priest now or after lunch. And sometimes, just sometimes, you got better, not because the treatment worked, but because the illness forgot. Or maybe it just got bored. In the Middle Ages, there wasn't a clear line between medicine and religion. In fact, there wasn't much of a line at all. Being sick wasn't just a physical problem. It was a spiritual one. If your body was suffering, then surely your soul had something to do with it. That's why, when you got ill, the first person to show up might not be a healer, but a priest. Or, more precisely, the village priest, the neighbor's cousin, and possibly 3 people who'd heard a rumor you coughed twice before sunset. Holy water was the aspirin of the day. Sprinkle some on the forehead. If that didn't work, try the wrists. If that failed too, maybe you needed stronger stuff, like a pilgrimage, or a relic of Saint Someone who healed a guy once. People carried amulets and charms not because they were fashionable, but because they believed illness could be warded off by wearing a piece of string that had touched a blessed bone kept in a church somewhere very far away. Prayers were considered medical interventions. You didn't just hope the patient got better, you prayed for it loudly, sometimes all night, with candles, incense, and the occasional goat sacrifice, if you were especially rural. Certain illnesses were thought to be punishments for pride, lust, gluttony, or, more realistically, eating questionable stew. If you were sick, it might mean you sinned, or someone else sinned, or that sin was simply in the air. Exorcisms weren't just for demons. They were used on the feverish, the delirious, and the unfortunate souls who talked too much in their sleep. Because if someone started speaking Latin backwards at 2 a.m., the natural assumption wasn't, they're hallucinating, but they've been possessed. And let's not forget the role of dreams. If you dreamed of fire, water, or wolves, someone would interpret it as a medical omen. Probably bad. Probably involving fasting. Possibly involving bleeding. In this world, the soul and the body were roommates, and when one got sick, both were expected to pay rent. So if your symptoms persisted, the next step wasn't surgery, it was confession. Because in medieval times, you didn't just fight disease with medicine. You fought it with ritual, repentance, and the quiet hope that God wasn't feeling particularly vengeful that day. Before X-rays, blood tests, or even thermometers, medical diagnosis in the Middle Ages relied on 2 highly advanced tools, your face and your smell. If you looked pale, sweaty, or vaguely haunted, congratulations, you were ill. If you also smelled bad, definitely ill. Of course, everyone smelled bad, so it took some serious concentration to detect illness-specific odors. Doctors, or people pretending to be doctors, would lean in close, sniff carefully, and try to interpret the message your body was sending. Fruity breath? Possibly diabetes. Sour breath? Maybe liver problems. Rotten breath? Probably just breakfast. Skin tone mattered too. A greenish tinge meant bile issues. Too red? Blood imbalance. Too pale? Maybe you were dying. Or just British. But in any case, something was out of harmony, and that was bad. Because medieval medicine was all about balance, of humours, of elements, of vague, invisible forces only monks could pronounce. Your eyes were inspected for cloudiness. Your tongue was examined for coating, which usually meant someone poked it with a stick and said, thoughtfully. Some healers even analysed urine by colour, smell, and taste. Yes, taste. Though historians suspect many just pretended to sip for dramatic effect. The act of diagnosing became something of a performance. The patient would lie in bed, moaning softly. The healer would stand nearby, nodding slowly, and mutter things like, Ah, yes, the cold wind has upset your spleen. Or, clearly, your black bile is in rebellion again. It didn't need to make sense. It just needed to sound old and vaguely Latin. If your symptoms were severe, people might blame the stars. Astrological charts were used to decide not only what was wrong with you, but when it was safe to treat you. So if Venus was in the wrong place, you might have to wait 3 days to be bled, even if you were already halfway unconscious. And if your condition included screaming, twitching, or seeing visions, then the diagnosis wasn't medical at all. It was spiritual. Possessed, they'd whisper. Touched by demons. Or worse, a woman having opinions. So yes, diagnosis in medieval times was a careful blend of squinting, sniffing, superstition, and confident guessing. And if the healer looked worried, that was the most accurate sign of all. In the medieval world, the line between a doctor and a fortune teller was, let's just say, blurry, very blurry. In fact, the person diagnosing your plague symptoms might also offer to read your future. Spoiler alert, it didn't look good. Most medieval healers weren't trained in science, they were trained in vibes. And the leading medical theory at the time was called the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If that sounds like a bad soup recipe, you're not wrong. The idea was simple. Your body was like a stew. Too much of one ingredient, and you got sick. So if you were angry, that meant too much yellow bile. Sad? Black bile? Sneezing? Probably phlegm. Dead? Definitely an imbalance. So the medieval doctor, usually a man in robes and an expression of great seriousness, would arrive, stroke his beard, real or glued, and declare something like, "Your blood is too strong today. We must release it," which was a fancy way of saying, "We're going to poke you with something sharp until you faint." Did they have actual degrees? Sometimes. If you were rich enough, you might get someone who studied at a university where they read Galen, a Roman physician who had great ideas for treating gladiators. But for most people, the village healer was someone who owned a book, knew a bit of Latin, and once correctly predicted a thunderstorm. Their toolkit was creative. Dried herbs, a rusty knife, a jar of leeches, and a small bag of confidence. Diagnosis involved the usual: checking your pulse, your tongue, your urine, and occasionally your horoscope. Treatment included bloodletting, purging, sweating, and shouting, "Begone foul humours," at your belly. Sometimes all at once, and yes, some of them meant well. But others were more like freelance guessers in medieval cosplay. If one cure didn't work, they'd try the opposite. Still sick? Clearly you had a spiritual problem. Try confessing to that one time you stole cheese. Maybe that's what upset your gallbladder. And if you died, which, let's be honest, you probably would, the healer could always shrug and say, "Ah, the stars were unkind this week. Very convenient." So no, your average medieval doctor wasn't the calm, clipboard-holding type you see on medical dramas. He was more like a wandering philosopher with a scalpel and a loose definition of success. And the worst part? He was still your best option. So, let's say you've been diagnosed, probably by someone wearing robes and quoting Aristotle, and the verdict is in. You have too much blood. Not metaphorically, literally. You are, according to medieval science, too full of life juice. And the only reasonable solution? Let it out. With a knife. This was called bloodletting, and it was one of the most popular medical treatments for over 1,000 years. Fever? Let some blood. Headache? Let more. Just not feeling great? Get that vein ready. The idea was simple. Your four bodily humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, needed balance. And if anything went wrong, blood was the first to be blamed. Too red in the face? Blood. Too pale? Still blood. Seen sweating near a goat? Blood, obviously. The tools were basic: a sharp knife, a bowl, and a vague idea of human anatomy. If you were fancy, they used a fleam, a small blade made just for slicing open veins. If not, it might just be whatever was sharp and nearby. In some cases, that meant scissors. In others, a particularly determined thumbnail. The location depended on your symptoms. A headache? Cut the forehead. Sore throat? Slice the neck. Digestive problems? Try the arm, leg, or wherever looked squishy. Some methods targeted specific veins connected to astrological signs. Because nothing says medicine like, Mars is in retrograde, so we'll drain your ankle. If you fainted during the process, and many did, that was considered a good sign. It meant the excess was leaving your body. If you woke up cold and confused, they'd wrap you in blankets, pray over you, and possibly let more blood, just in case. In wealthier towns, professional bloodletters existed, often barbers, the same ones who trimmed beards and pulled teeth. The red and white barber pole? Yep, that's not peppermint. It's a historical nod to bloody bandages drying outside the shop. Sometimes they used leeches instead of blades. These were considered more natural, though still very bitey. A single patient could have a dozen leeches working at once. If that sounds horrifying, it is. But it was also trendy. Nothing said, I'm receiving care, quite like a jar of worms clinging to your armpit. And the most chilling part? Sometimes it worked. Not because the science was right, but because rest, hydration, and lying very still actually helped, as long as you didn't bleed out first. So yes. In the Middle Ages, getting better often meant getting paler, leakier, and very, very dizzy. So you're feeling unwell, and you can't afford a monk with a Latin book. That's fine, because down the street, past the dung cart and the shouting fishwife, there's someone who can help. Your local barber. But in the Middle Ages, the barber didn't just offer a shave and a haircut. He was also your neighborhood surgeon, your dentist, your bloodletter, and sometimes your unofficial therapist. They were called barber surgeons. And they were the multitaskers of medieval healthcare. Need a tooth pulled? He's got pliers. Bleeding too much? He's got cloth strips. Skull cracked open during a tavern brawl? He'll take a look. Right after he trims someone's beard. The logic was simple. Barbers already had sharp instruments, a place to work, and a good grip on squirming customers. So why not throw minor surgery into the mix? Besides, the medical profession was largely reserved for university-trained elites, and they didn't usually treat regular people. That job fell to the man holding the razor. His shop would smell like hair, sweat, soap, and maybe yesterday's soup. Hanging on the wall, scissors, razors, saws, some used for grooming, some for amputations. The only way to tell the difference was how much rust was on the blade. The famous red and white striped barber pole. That's a tribute to blood and bandages, a reminder that this man once tied off a leg stump before lunch. It's quaint now. It was much less quaint when you were the leg stump. Appointments weren't necessary. You'd walk in, say, I've got this pain, and he'd say something reassuring like, let's see what we can cut. Sometimes it was just draining an abscess. Other times, he might remove a bad humor, which meant poking around until something unpleasant leaked out. There was no anesthesia, of course. Maybe some ale, maybe a belt to bite. Surgery was fast, brutal, and extremely loud. If you didn't faint, the barber considered you strong. If you did faint, that was expected. Recovery happened at home, in bed, next to the same fleas that gave you the infection in the first place. Still, for many people, the barber surgeon was the only accessible medical help, and occasionally they even saved lives, or at least delayed death long enough for the priest to arrive. So yes, in medieval times, if you wanted a trim and a minor amputation, you only had to make one stop. In modern times, when you're sick, you might get antibiotics, maybe some vitamins, possibly a comforting mug of tea. In the Middle Ages, you got leeches, slimy, wriggling, eager little creatures who were more trusted than most doctors. Because back then, leeches weren't just pond dwellers, they were medical instruments. Portable, reusable, terrifying. People believed illness came from imbalances, too much blood, too much heat, too much something. The solution? Remove it. And what better way to remove excess than with a hungry worm that sucks professionally? Leeches were kept in jars, carefully labeled, and occasionally shared between patients. You didn't pick the cleanest one. You picked the one that still had energy. If it wriggled, good sign. If it was full, you waited your turn. Treatment was straightforward. Find a vein, place the leech, and wait. Sometimes several at once, on the neck, the arm, the lower back. You'd lie still while they latched on and did their work. The sensation? Somewhere between ticklish and mildly traumatic. Doctors and barbers believed the leech knew exactly how much blood to take. Nature's surgeon. No need for measurements, no guesswork, just trust the process. Even if the leech had just come from someone else's infected toe, leeches were used for everything. Fevers, headaches, skin problems, mysterious sadness, moral weakness, and occasionally being too enthusiastic in church. If you were wealthy, you might receive imported leeches from a better pond. If you were poor, the local swamp would do. Some families even kept their own leech jars at home, like a first aid kit, but alive and squishy. And yes, the results were mixed. Some patients felt better, possibly due to placebo, possibly because rest and hydration did most of the work. Others didn't fare so well. Too many leeches could lead to infection, anemia, or the sudden realization that medieval life was not going as planned. But despite all this, leeches held on, literally and metaphorically. For centuries, they were seen as elegant, natural, and oddly stylish. Physicians used them with pride, patients accepted them with dread, and in a strange way, leeches offered hope. Not because they healed, but because they looked like someone was trying. A jar of moving solutions. An attempt at balance. A silent promise. We don't know what's wrong, but something is leaving your body. Let's pretend that's progress. So yes, in medieval medicine, the leech was a symbol of healing, of mystery, and of quietly losing blood while everyone nodded wisely. Let's say you were lucky enough to avoid knives, fire, or leeches. Instead, your healer offered you something gentler. A potion, a warm cup, a medieval smoothie of sorts. The ingredients? Wine, herbs, a raw egg, and Latin poetry. In the Middle Ages, medicine wasn't about chemistry, it was about hope in liquid form. And if the potion tasted awful, good. That meant it was probably working. A typical recipe might include wine or ale as the base, not for taste, but because water was often dangerous to drink, and alcohol was at least somewhat sterile, in theory. Into this murky base, they'd add herbs, rosemary, sage, wormwood, or whatever looked slightly magical and hadn't been stepped on by a goat. Then came the eggs. Yes, raw eggs. Not to boost protein, but because they were believed to bind the medicine together. In practice, they added texture. In reality, they added salmonella. But no one knew that word yet, so it didn't count. Some mixtures also included honey, ashes, ground snail shells, powdered bones, or bits of dried frog, depending on the illness and the available pantry. Everything had symbolic meaning. If it grew near a church, it cured sin. If it smelled bad, it cured everything else. And to truly activate the potion's healing powers, you had to speak Latin. Not fluently, just enough to sound vaguely holy. A few borrowed lines from a Bible, a chant about St. Michael, and maybe a confident Dominus Vobiscum, while stirring counterclockwise. The final product was thick, murky, warm, and slightly terrifying. You'd drink it under supervision. If you gagged, that was normal. If you vomited, also normal. If you passed out, woke up confused, and claimed you saw angels, now we're making progress. Did it work? Occasionally. Mostly because you were hydrated, resting, and surrounded by people who deeply believed you should survive. Sometimes that belief was more effective than the herbs. And if it didn't work, the recipe would be adjusted. More garlic, fewer eggs, a different psalm. Add a feather this time. Medicine was fluid, literally and figuratively. So yes, in medieval times, a healing drink might taste like spoiled salad dressing mixed with communion wine, but it was given with care, and sometimes with poetry. And if nothing else, it made you too tired to complain. Of all the potions in a medieval healer's cabinet, one stood above the rest. Mysterious, powerful, slightly too effective, liquid opium. Known by names like laudanum or simply the strong stuff, this was the medieval version of take two and see what happens. It was made by soaking crushed poppy flowers in wine, letting it sit until it became syrupy, cloudy, and deeply suspicious, then giving it to whoever looked most uncomfortable. Its uses? Endless. Headache, opium, toothache, opium. Can't sleep because you're afraid of dying from the plague? Opium. Already have the plague and want to stop thinking about it? Double opium. It dulled pain, slowed thoughts, and gently wrapped your nervous system in a foggy medieval blanket. People said it worked miracles. People also said it made them forget their own names. Both were technically true. Doctors used it generously. A few drops for the child who wouldn't stop crying, a spoonful for the soldier with a shattered leg, a gulp for the nobleman who insisted he was being haunted by invisible frogs. There was no clear dosage, just instincts. Give him enough to relax, but not so much that he forgets he has a body, which, as you can imagine, went wrong fairly often. Side effects included dizziness, confusion, dependency, and occasionally, sudden silence. But since it looked like you were peacefully asleep, most people considered that an upgrade. Opium didn't cure anything, but in a world where most illnesses couldn't be cured anyway, comfort was the next best thing. And opium delivered that, in heavy, syrup-coated waves. For some, it became a nightly ritual, a few drops before bed, then a few more, then, well, mornings became optional. Opium didn't just numb pain, it numbed time. Days blended, dreams stretched. You stopped worrying about whether your spleen was inflamed and started wondering if stars were edible. In that way, opium was more than a medicine. It was escape in a bottle. From pain, from noise, from plague carts rattling by your window. A brief, floating pause in a world full of knives and coughing. Of course, eventually, you needed more to feel less. And if you ran out, reality came back loudly. But for a while, there was peace. And in the Middle Ages, peace, even a foggy, floral-scented one, was rare enough to be called a miracle. In modern medicine, surgery means clean gloves, soft lighting, and the promise that you'll sleep through the worst part. In the Middle Ages, surgery meant you stayed awake, fully alert, surrounded by strangers, and the only thing putting you to sleep was blood loss. There was no anesthesia, not even the idea of it. The best you could hope for was a stiff drink, a leather strap to bite, and someone holding your shoulders down. That was considered preparation. If you were lucky, someone handed you a cloth, a chunk of wood, or your own sleeve, something to muffle the scream and keep you from biting through your tongue. Pain management was simple. Don't move too much. And maybe yell quietly, so you didn't startle the chickens. The surgeon, often also your barber, neighbor, or traveling expert with stains on his boots, would begin quickly, not out of cruelty, but necessity, because the longer it took, the more you bled. Speed was a skill. If he could cut, pull, or saw through something in under a minute, that was considered medical excellence. If he hesitated, you'd feel everything twice. Instruments weren't sterilized. They were wiped, maybe, with a rag that had been used before, maybe by someone else. And boiling water? Only if it happened to be nearby, or if someone was making soup. There was no sterile gown, no gloves, just bare hands, rolled up sleeves, and the confidence of a man who once read part of a scroll. Blood splashed, bones cracked, and the air filled with the sound of pain. Yours. After the procedure, there was no recovery ward. You were helped into a bed, possibly the same one someone had just died in, and told to rest. Infection was likely. Survival was uncertain, but at least the thing had been cut out, right? And if you cried, no one blamed you. If you passed out, that was smart. If you ran away halfway through, they'd chase you, slowly, unless they were tired. So yes, medieval surgery was a test of pain, tolerance, faith, and luck, in that order. And the only anesthesia available was the part where your memory tried to forget it ever happened. In medieval times, if someone started shaking, muttering nonsense, or talking to invisible birds, you didn't call a doctor, you called a priest. Or at least someone who knew Latin and had holy water in their bag, because clearly that person wasn't sick, they were possessed. Yes, possession. By demons, evil spirits, or the ghost of someone who died angry near a tree. Medical explanations came second, or never. People believed that illness could be spiritual punishment for sin, pride, or just walking past the wrong graveyard at the wrong hour. So when your daughter screamed at night, your neighbor clutched a rosary. And when you developed a twitch in your left eye, someone whispered, "It's in him now." The signs were vague but terrifying. Sudden fever? Possessed. Speaking another language? Definitely possessed. Refusing to eat cabbage? Suspicious behavior. Call the priest. The church had rituals for this. Special prayers, holy symbols, even chains. The afflicted person might be tied to a chair while a priest read scripture and flicked water at their forehead. If they hissed, flinched, or quoted bad poetry, proof the demon was real. And if the person died during the ritual, even more proof. That meant the demon had been strong, or the patient had too much sin. Either way, it was spiritually satisfying. Medically, not ideal. Some healers leaned into this system. If their treatments failed, they'd suggest calling a priest. It's not your liver, madam. It's Lucifer. A convenient way to deflect blame and also avoid refunding that bag of dried snails. Women were especially vulnerable. A fever, a rash, a dream about birds. And suddenly you were not just ill, but dangerous. Possessed, bewitched, or a witch yourself. The cure? Not medicine. Usually fire. Of course, not every case was dramatic. Sometimes the demon went away, the fever broke, the person stopped yelling, and everyone said, the prayer worked. No one asked if, maybe, they just got better on their own. That would ruin the narrative. In the medieval mind, health and holiness were deeply connected. If you were healthy, God liked you. If you were sick, something dark had crept in. Maybe from your soul, maybe from your neighbor, maybe from that cheese you left under the stairs. So, yes, in this world, your symptoms weren't just troubling, they were theological. And sometimes the scariest thing wasn't the sickness, but who showed up to treat it. Let's talk about hygiene, or rather, the medieval absence of it. Because in the Middle Ages, the concept of clean was more about spiritual purity than soap and water. If you looked dirty but confessed regularly, you were fine. If you bathed often but skipped church, well, now you were suspicious, possibly French. Public sanitation systems didn't really exist. There were no indoor bathrooms, no plumbing, no flushing. What you had, if you were lucky, was a wooden bucket, shared by multiple people, emptied occasionally, into the street. Yes, the street. Waste disposal meant opening a window and hoping your aim was decent. If you've ever wondered where the phrase, "watch your step" came from, now you know. Alleys became rivers of waste. Gutters weren't for rain. And that smell, lingering in the market square? Not fish. Not entirely. Houses were cramped. Multiple people in one room. Often sleeping on the floor. Sometimes with livestock nearby, for warmth, they said. Or because the chicken refused to leave. Either way, privacy was a myth, and ventilation was a rumor. Bathing happened rarely. Weekly if you were wealthy. Seasonally if you weren't. Soap existed, but was expensive. Water was either cold, dirty, or too far away to justify hauling unless you were already dying of thirst. Clothes weren't washed often. Some people simply wore them until they disintegrated. And even then, the fabric might be repurposed into bandages, cleaning rags, or more clothes. Laundry day was less a routine and more a special event involving boiling cauldrons and public judgment. Diseases spread quickly, not because of curses or bad stars, but because everyone was living, coughing, and sneezing in each other's personal space. Windows stayed shut. Air stood still. Fleas and lice were regular companions. Rats, practically roommates. And hand washing, almost non-existent. There were no sinks, no soap pumps, and frankly, no real awareness that hands could carry invisible death. People handled raw meat, sick relatives, and muddy pigs. and then went straight to lunch. So yes, the medieval world was many things. Devout, poetic, occasionally romantic. But hygienic? Absolutely not. It was a place where one shared bucket served 10 people, and that same bucket had a name, possibly Gerald. Let's say you were a woman in medieval Europe. You weren't rich, you weren't noble, you didn't own land. You just lived, quietly, tending your herbs, minding your sheep, maybe humming strange tunes while drying plants by the fire. That was enough to get you accused of witchcraft. Because in this world, being female and slightly unusual was a public health hazard. Fever? You must have cursed someone. A neighbor's cow stopped producing milk? You definitely hexed it. Someone dreamed of a raven? Obviously your fault. Birds liked you too much. And if you knew anything about herbs, midwifery, or which mushroom wouldn't kill a man, congratulations. That made you dangerous. Too much knowledge, not enough submission. A suspicious combination. Which accusations didn't need proof. Just vibes. Maybe you had a mole. Maybe you talked to yourself. Maybe you were seen gathering plants at dusk. Or worse, maybe you helped another woman survive childbirth. Unnatural, unchristian, uncomfortable for men. People were genuinely terrified. Not of what you did, but what you might do. Sneeze in the wrong direction? The harvest failed. Glance at a sick child? They died 3 days later. It didn't matter that you were just there to offer soup. Your presence became evidence. Trials were creative. Sometimes they tied you to a chair and dunked you in a river. If you floated, you were a witch. If you sank, innocent, but now dead, a lose-lose situation. Other times, they searched your body for a witch's mark, any scar, freckle, or birthmark that could be blamed for someone else's rash. And if none were found, they'd keep looking. Eventually, something would itch. You could also be tested by prayer. They'd make you recite scripture. If you hesitated, stumbled, or mispronounced something, clearly the devil had your tongue. And if you spoke too perfectly, that was suspicious too. Who gave you such eloquence? Many women were executed not for casting spells, but for being poor, widowed, or inconvenient. A healer who helped too much. A midwife who questioned a priest. A wife who didn't smile enough at market. And the worst part? If you actually were sick, fever, delirium, visions from dehydration, they didn't treat you. They feared you. You weren't a patient. You were a threat. So yes, in the medieval world, falling ill was dangerous. But being a woman, that could be fatal. After everything, the leeches, the prayers, the potions made of wine and regret, one truth quietly emerged in the background. Sometimes, the people who did nothing lived longer. It wasn't intentional. They weren't refusing treatment out of wisdom. They were just too poor, too far from town, or too skeptical of the man holding a knife and a jar of frogs. And somehow, that helped. While others were being bled, purged, burned, or blessed into a coma, these accidental survivors were at home, lying still, drinking boiled water, and not being poked by barbers. Their treatment plan? Sleep. Time. And not getting stepped on by a priest mid-exorcism. Ironically, their inaction protected them from the so-called cures that did more harm than the illness itself. No bloodletting meant no infection. No herbal cocktails meant no food poisoning. No holy water in the eyes meant better visibility. Of course, they weren't comfortable. Medieval homes were cold, noisy, and full of smells that could best be described as organic. But at least they weren't being force-fed garlic syrup by someone quoting Galen. Sometimes, survival came down to doing less, not more. Letting the fever burn, letting the body rest, letting the herbs stay in the garden instead of inside your soup. But no one wanted to admit this. Doctors needed to justify their tools. Priests needed to justify their candles. And neighbors needed to justify their gossip. So, stories of miraculous recoveries were told. Conveniently, those who died from treatment weren't around to give feedback. And yet, if you looked closely, a pattern formed. The quiet ones, the ones who stayed home, the ones who avoided the hospital, the potions, the knives, they sometimes came out the other side. A little thinner, a little paler, but alive, not heroic, not praised, just, still breathing. In the end, medieval medicine was loud, dramatic, bloody. It offered certainty where there was none, and that certainty often hurt more than it helped. So yes, ironically, the people who trusted less, moved less, and let their bodies do the hard work were sometimes the only ones who survived, not because they knew better, but because they were lucky enough to be forgotten by the system. And sometimes, in history, being forgotten is the best chance you have. So now you know. Being sick in the Middle Ages wasn't just unpleasant, it was a game of chance, superstition, and staying out of reach of sharp things. You weren't treated. You were tested, by the gods, by the stars, by your neighbor with a rusty spoon. You were prescribed prayers, frogs, wine-soaked leaves, and the occasional, "Don't worry, it'll drain by morning." Sometimes you got better, often you didn't, and no one really understood why. But what's remarkable is how people tried. With no microscopes, no antibiotics, no germ theory, they still believed. In herbs, in rituals, in chanting over soup, they wrapped suffering in meaning and called it healing. And maybe, in a strange way, that helped too. Not medically, but emotionally. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed with your soft blanket and your body blessedly free of leeches, remember this. You live in the best time to have a sore throat. And if you ever time travel back to the 1300s, don't cough, don't speak Latin in your sleep. And above all, don't trust anyone holding a bucket, a knife, or a Bible. Sleep well, and may your humors stay balanced. Before ink met parchment, before the alphabet was born, before anyone knew how to write down a feeling, people still loved. In the time before language, there were no letters to send, no poems to recite, no diaries to hide under pillows. And yet, the heart still stirred, the soul still reached, and love, quiet, slow, and fragile, still happened. Imagine a world without writing. No books, no paper, no names even in the way we know them. Only sounds, symbols, gestures, glances. Life was full of surviving, gathering, hunting, stitching, cooking, walking, resting, watching the sky change colors and hoping the weather would be kind. And still, among all of that, someone looked at someone else, a little longer than necessary. Someone paused near the fire just a bit too long. Someone smiled, not the kind of smile made with lips, but with eyes and breath. That was enough. A feeling had passed between them, a quiet electricity in a world that had no words for romance or belonging. But it was love, the oldest kind. Without writing, there were no love letters. So they carved. Not pages, but stone. Not paper, but wood. Marks scratched into the world, left behind like breadcrumbs for someone else to find. Sometimes, a stone was smoothed and placed where the other might walk. Sometimes, a line was drawn in the dirt, then covered again, only visible to the one who knew to look. A broken shell, a colored feather, a pattern made from pebbles. These were their messages. Delicate, easily lost, but deeply meant. There was no "I love you" written in looping script. No "thinking of you" text sent at midnight. Only silence and symbols and hope, because in those early days of humanity, everything took time. Love, most of all. To love someone meant to wait. Not for minutes, not for days, but for moons to pass, for the rains to come and go, for the herds to return, or the sun to shift in the sky just right. To love meant to carve something, on rock, on memory, on the inside of the mind, and leave it behind. And often, the person it was meant for never saw it. The stone was buried. The feather blew away. The pattern of pebbles was kicked by a passing animal. The world moved on, and the message was lost. But the love was still real, even if no one read it, even if it was never answered. It was love given freely, quietly, patiently. And that kind of love, honestly, you probably wouldn't survive. Not today. Today, love comes with instant replies, with typing bubbles and read receipts, with emojis and late-night voice notes, We panic if a message is left unseen. We feel forgotten if a reply takes more than an hour. But imagine waiting 3 winters, 4 harvests, a full cycle of the moon 20 times over, and still not knowing if they're coming back. That was how people loved once, when there were no calendars, no clocks, no certainty at all. They said, "I'll return when the river overflows again." Or, "Look for me when the red flowers bloom on the southern hill." That was the promise, and you had to keep it in your heart. There was nowhere to write it down. Nothing to reread when you got lonely. Only memory, only belief. They loved across distance, across seasons, across silence. Because what else was there? They didn't know the word relationship, but they knew how it felt to miss someone, to remember their smell, to dream of their face, to hold a stone they once touched and wonder if they still lived. And when they met again, if they met again, there were no words. Only hands and time and breath, and the quiet relief of being seen again. So yes, before there was writing, there was still love. It looked different. It moved slower. It wasn't shared on social feeds or shouted across crowded streets. But it lived, etched in stone, tied into simple bracelets, buried in the softest soil, beneath the tree where they once stood side by side. Some of those old love messages still exist, carved into ancient cave walls, scratched into clay tablets that were never sent, fragments of pottery with lines no one can fully understand, but still, somehow, we know what they meant. Because love doesn't need a dictionary. It just needs time and a place to rest. So, if you find an odd rock tucked beneath a tree, or a strange mark on a wall in a museum, maybe, just maybe, you're looking at someone's love letter, a message that waited thousands of years, not to be read, but simply to be remembered. Long before ink touched parchment, the first love letters were carved into permanence. They were not written to be read quickly, nor answered promptly. They were not sent by riders or pigeons. They were left behind, in stone, in clay, in silence, and sometimes never seen again. Somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, someone pressed a reed into wet clay and marked a symbol not found in any transaction record. It wasn't about goats, or grain, or taxes. It was about someone, a shape that only the sender and the intended would understand. A half moon, scratched beneath a name. A dot beneath a familiar sign. A space left blank, and that blank meant everything. In ancient Egypt, love poems were etched onto broken pottery. Shards of fired clay, once part of a bowl or vase, became the canvases for longing. Words were scratched onto them. Clumsy, awkward sometimes, written by hands that were used to holding tools, not styluses. But that made them honest, tender, real. You might think love should be wrapped in silk and sealed with wax. But the first messages of love were left on whatever was available. The back of a tile, the inside of a cave, the underside of a river stone. Not for display, not for approval, just for the faint possibility that someone might find it. Someday. These were not messages that needed to be delivered. They were messages that needed to exist. In medieval times, when not everyone could read, symbols became stories. A heart scratched into the bark of a tree, 2 initials hidden beneath a bench in a church, a carved bird in a hidden chapel, flying toward a sun that only one person would ever understand. These carvings weren't public declarations. They were private rituals. They said, "I was here. I thought of you. I left something behind." And often, no reply came. Not because the message was ignored, but because no one ever found it. Or they did, centuries later, in museums, on dig sites, inside tombs. Archaeologists uncover them now, wondering what they meant. And sometimes the words still whisper, "You mattered to someone once." You wouldn't last a day in that kind of patience. You wouldn't carve a message you didn't expect to be read. You wouldn't write something on a rock and walk away, hoping that rain, wind, and time wouldn't erase it before someone who mattered passed by. But they did. They pressed their feelings into things that endure. Stone, clay, bark, bone. Because feelings, back then, weren't fleeting. There was no rush, no urgency. Only time, and the deep need to place something of the heart into the world. A pottery shard with a thumbprint, a rune on a blade's hilt, a woven knot in the hem of a cloak. Not letters, but love. Not sentences, but symbols. In Iceland, runes were once inscribed into wooden sticks and tucked inside houses or worn around the neck, spells of affection and protection. In Celtic lands, lovers tied clooty rags to sacred trees, one piece of cloth for one whispered prayer. Not to be read, but to be seen, to mean something. They didn't need responses. They needed ritual. They needed to know that love had taken form in something tangible, even if temporary. And when that piece of bark rotted, or that stone was washed away, the memory stayed. Because when you carve love into time itself, it doesn't need to last forever. It just needs to have been real. So no, the first love letters weren't written with fancy handwriting. They were scratched, pressed, etched, burned, broken. Sometimes they were prayers, sometimes curses. Often they were simple gestures, not even meant to be understood by others. You wouldn't last a day, sending a message that might take a lifetime to arrive. You wouldn't mark a thought on clay and trust the fire not to crack it. You wouldn't leave a pebble trail for someone who might never walk that path again. But they did, because love, for them, was not convenience. It was endurance. And sometimes, it was a single word on a piece of bone, buried in earth, that said everything. Yours. To love someone is already hard. But to love someone far away, when you have no idea if they're even alive, that's something else entirely. Today, when someone travels, you track their flight. You send a quick, text me when you land, and they do. In seconds, you know they're safe. You know they're thinking of you. You know where they are. But once, long ago, that was impossible. And yet, people still loved. Even when distance meant more than just miles. It meant time, uncertainty, silence. Imagine you live in a small village. Your world is tiny, just a handful of homes, a few paths through the trees, a river that rises and falls depending on the season. And then one day, the person you love has to leave. Maybe for a trade journey. Maybe to find better land. Maybe because war is coming, or famine, or family duty. You don't know when they'll return. You don't know if they'll return. There is no post office. No horses running messages across the kingdom. No one delivers letters sealed with wax. There is just the hope that the person you love remembers you, and the hope that they are still alive somewhere beneath the same sky. And yet, you send something. Not a letter. Maybe a carving on a flat stone, left by the old fig tree where you used to meet. Maybe a bundle of dried herbs tied in a familiar knot, placed near a shrine. Maybe just a small clay token with a familiar mark scratched into it, hidden where only the two of you would know to look. It's not certain they'll find it. It's not certain it won't be blown away, buried, or washed clean by the rain. But you leave it anyway, because it is all you can do. In some cultures, people tied messages into knots, literally. Strands of string knotted in patterns, representing feelings, promises, names. They would be left hanging from trees, from caves, from the walls of sacred places. Sometimes, the message was never read, because the person it was meant for never came back. And still, people kept tying. Because sometimes, love is not about being heard. Sometimes it's about believing someone might listen. You wait. You wait through the dry season, then the rains. You watch for the first frost. You listen to the birds to see when they begin their migration. Each change in nature becomes a possible sign. Maybe they'll return now. Maybe they'll see what I left. Maybe they'll know I waited. But seasons pass. Years even. And still, nothing. You begin to wonder, did they forget? Did they move on? Did something happen? Are they buried somewhere far away, under a sky you'll never see? But the heart keeps waiting. Quietly. Stubbornly. Sometimes, you visit the old place again. The fig tree, the riverside rock, the path where you used to meet. And sometimes, if you're lucky, there is a mark. A line scratched freshly. A pebble shaped like a heart. A whisper left in the wind. Not much, but enough. Enough to feel seen, remembered, still loved. And what if nothing is there? Then you wait again. because to stop waiting would be to accept forgetting. There are stories, real stories, from ancient places, of clay tablets never delivered, of small carved idols buried beneath floorboards, never picked up, of messages sung into the wind, meant for no one but the stars. Some were found centuries later, by archaeologists, by travelers, by accident. They weren't read in time, but they were still there, still holding something human. And honestly, most of us today wouldn't last a day with that kind of love. We like updates. We like tracking numbers. We like knowing, not wondering. We would break under the weight of so much silence, so much not knowing. But once, people loved without feedback. They loved across oceans, across deserts, across lifetimes. And sometimes, the message did arrive. A returning footstep. A worn hand holding a token you thought was lost. A smile, older now, but familiar. And you didn't need to say anything, because the message was already written. Long ago. In a knot. On a rock. In your waiting. So next time you're frustrated by a late reply, or worried when your message sits unread, remember, once love was left by a river and carried away by the rain, and no one ever knew if it reached the one it was meant for, but still, they left it. And that's how you know it was real. Love, when it was real, did not always glitter. It did not sparkle with jewels. It did not arrive wrapped in ribbons. Often, it was small, faded, fragile, but it was true. In a time before marketplaces sold heart-shaped things, before rings were cast in gold, and vows were written in books, before people used flowers as apologies and diamonds as promises, there were different kinds of gifts. Softer ones, quieter ones. Gifts that held meaning, not money. Imagine a string bracelet, hand, woven from dry reeds by the river. Not precious in any shop, but precious to the one who received it. It took time to braid, it took care. And each knot carried a thought. I was thinking of you when I made this. Or a smooth stone, warmed by the sun, carried in a pocket for days. Chosen not because it was rare, just because it felt right. Because it reminded someone of the warmth of a certain hand, or the shape of a certain smile. Or a feather found on a long walk, tucked into a small bundle of herbs, left where the other might pass. Not extravagant, not useful, but honest. In the medieval world, people gave what they had, not what they could buy. And sometimes, what they had wasn't much. A piece of wool, dyed with crushed berries, tied around the wrist. A carved symbol hidden inside a wooden cup. A single apple, carefully chosen, not eaten, left on a doorstep in the frost. Small things, quiet gestures, but they said what words often couldn't. Because love, then, was not performed. It was practiced. It lived in effort. In remembering, in walking 3 miles out of the way just to pass the place where the other once stood. It lived in giving something you might need for yourself. A pair of gloves you mended by firelight. A pouch of salt wrapped in fabric. A song hummed quietly into someone's ear as they fell asleep. No one clapped. No one took pictures. No one said, "You're such goals." And still, they gave. Not to impress, but to connect. And sometimes, those gifts were broken, because they were used, because they were carried every day, because they were loved too hard. A clay charm that cracked in the cold, a wooden ring that wore smooth from being touched too often, a dried flower that crumbled between pages after too many years of waiting. But even broken, the gift held meaning, sometimes more than when it was new, because love wears out things. That's part of its truth. You wouldn't last a day with gifts like that. Today, you scroll for something meaningful under $50. You worry about packaging, delivery, same-day shipping. You panic if the wrapping looks wrinkled. But once, people gave what their hands could shape, and that was enough. In some cultures, lovers exchanged symbols only they could understand. A carved line meant, "I remember." 3 dots meant, "I wait." A spiral meant, "You are part of me now." No one else needed to know, because the gift wasn't for anyone else. There are stories of broken pottery found in graves, carefully placed beside the hand of someone long gone. Scholars still argue about what the pieces meant, but perhaps they were just simple gifts. A parting token, a last memory, a message, you were loved. Some of these gifts lasted. Most didn't. They were made of things the earth takes back: wood, cloth, skin, string. But that made them real. Because real things don't last forever. They soften, they fade, they fall apart. But while they exist, they carry weight. Not gold weight, heart weight. So next time someone gives you something small, something they made, and you feel like it isn't enough, remember, once upon a time, a girl wore a bracelet made of horsehair. A boy kept a small carved tooth tucked inside his boot. An old woman still remembered the boy, who gave her a pebble the color of her eyes. None of them were rich, but all of them were loved. So no, the gifts didn't shine, but they stayed. In drawers, in pockets, in dreams. And that's the thing about true love. It doesn't always look bright, but it always leaves a mark. Today, time is everywhere. It lives on your wrist, in your pocket, on glowing screens beside your bed. You know the hour. You know the minute. You count it. You race it. You schedule every moment. But once, time was different. It did not tick. It did not buzz. It did not wake you up at 7 a.m. and remind you of meetings, because there were no clocks, no bells for school, no deadlines, no running late. Time moved slowly, quietly, soft as the wind, unseen but always present, changing the air, the color of the leaves, the smell of the soil. People watched for it in the sky. They listened for it in the bird's song. They felt it in their bones, in the frost creeping into the corners of their homes. And love, well, love followed time's lead. You didn't say, "I'll see you at 3. You said, "When the sun touches the hilltop," or "When the shadow of the tree is long." You didn't say, "I'll come back next month." You said, "When the rains have passed," or "When the wildflowers bloom again in the valley." That's how time worked. Not in numbers, but in changes, in waiting, in watching. A single message, something small, a carved token, a whispered promise, could take seasons to deliver. Not because the person was far away, but because the moment wasn't right, because the river hadn't swelled yet, because the moon was wrong. They waited for signs. The first frost, the migration of geese, the return of a certain kind of flower. These were their calendars. These were their clocks. And when they made a promise, they spoke in nature's language. "I'll find you after the snow melts. I'll leave a gift when the fireflies come back. I'll wait until the 3rd full moon, and if you haven't come by then, I'll still wait." Imagine loving like that. Imagine measuring your longing by how high the river rose, or how many stars you could see at night. No notifications, no typing indicators, no phone to hold on to while you waited. Just silence, and trust, and time that moved like wind through trees, slow, steady, impossible to grasp. You wouldn't last a day with time like that, because you panic if someone doesn't reply in 5 minutes. You stare at the clock while they leave you on red. You ask, "Where are you?" before you even give them time to arrive. But once, people waited whole seasons just to hear a whisper of love. And the waiting wasn't empty. It was full. Full of watching the world change. Full of building fires, drying herbs, preparing food for someone who might come, or might not. Time was not something to fill. It was something to move through. To feel. It passed in slow, wide circles. Like the moon. Like the tides. Like the way the heart softens over weeks, not seconds. And when the person did return, when the path was walked again, and 2 people stood face to face, they did not count the days. They did not ask, "Why did it take so long?" They said, "You came." And that was enough. In some parts of the world, lovers etched signs into tree bark or stones. Not with dates, but with markers of seasonal time. A crescent moon, a blooming flower, a harvest symbol. Not to say when, but to say around then, because love was never exact, and neither was time. Even goodbyes were tied to the seasons. I'll love you through the winter. I'll remember you when the rains return. I'll carry you like the wind carries seeds. These weren't metaphors. They were measures. Literal ways of knowing how long love might last. And sometimes it lasted much longer than anyone expected. Archaeologists have found signs of seasonal memory, offerings left not once, but every year, in the same place. A carved stone placed anew every spring. A flower laid down at the equinox. Rituals of love and remembering, tied not to time, but to rhythm. So next time you check the time, when you say 5 more minutes, when you complain about being too late or too early, remember that once love had no clocks, only patience, only seasons, only the long, soft waiting between one blooming and the next. There were times when love arrived quietly, in glances, in footsteps, in breath shared beside a fire. And then there were times when love came, just as war did. It was never convenient. You might have just met them. You might have just begun to hope. And then the summons came, to defend the land, to protect the village, to follow duty, honor, oath, fear. And so they left. Not with a suitcase, not with a phone to call home, but with a small pack, a blade, maybe a piece of bread, and the weight of goodbye. You didn't know if they'd come back. They didn't know either. There were no military updates, no safe arrival texts, just silence and waiting. But still, people left messages behind. A carved symbol in the wood near the door, a mark scratched into the underside of a rock, hidden beside the well, a cloth tied in a knot that only you two would recognize. Sometimes they whispered things before they left. Not long declarations, just words like, "Look at the moon when you miss me," or "I'll return when the wild geese fly south." Simple, but full of everything that couldn't be said out loud. And sometimes, they left a letter, not written in ink, not sealed in wax, but etched into something that would last. A wooden shield, carved softly along the edge. A bone pendant marked with lines like a secret code. Even the inside of a helmet, lined with thread from the person they loved. It wasn't meant to be read aloud. It was meant to stay close, to remind them who they were fighting for, because war was not like it is in stories. There were no shining victories. There were no speeches. Only mud. Only fear. Only long nights in the cold, wondering if the person you loved was still watching the sky from the same place. And often, they didn't come back. Their names were never carved into monuments. No history book remembers their face. But sometimes, the thing they carried returned. A token found in a fallen soldier's pocket. A stone carved with initials, sent back by a friend. A small message scrawled on parchment, blood-stained and wrinkled, never delivered. And in those moments, the gift returned. But the giver did not. Imagine holding a letter like that, one that survived the person who wrote it. Their last words, written in shaky hand, perhaps under the pale light of a dying fire. A farewell that never knew it was final. You read it slowly, not just with your eyes, but with your hands, your breath, your memory, and you don't cry right away. You just sit, because grief, like love, arrives in silence. Sometimes there was no letter, just a feeling, a gust of wind, a dream, a bird that landed exactly where they used to sit. And you knew. You just knew. In old villages, some people never moved the last gift they were given. A carved spoon, a wool scarf, a simple ring made from twisted grass. It stayed on the shelf, forever, untouched, because it was no longer just a gift. It was the last message, and they never wanted to lose it. You wouldn't last a day with that kind of loss. You, who panic at a message left unread, who grow restless when there's no reply in an hour, who think silence means the end. But once, silence was all there was. And still, they waited. And still, they remembered. Sometimes, war took the person, but left the letter, and that was all there was to hold. Sometimes, a soldier carved their love into the hilt of their blade. Sometimes, into a tree near where they slept. Sometimes, into their own skin, small symbols hidden beneath armor. They didn't know if anyone would ever see it. But they did it anyway, because loving someone, even when you might not return, was its own kind of courage. Today, we wear love on the outside, on social profiles, in pictures, in public. Back then, love had to live in quiet places, in corners, in the folds of fabric, in the curve of a symbol scratched into stone. And when war came, those small things were what people held on to. A letter that smelled like smoke, a scarf that still held their warmth, a word repeated over and over again, just so it wouldn't be forgotten. Not all love stories end with reunions. Many ended with wind, with rain, with a name spoken softly under one's breath, again and again, until it faded. But if even one letter came back, even one mark, one token, one piece of the heart that left, then it meant the love still lived, even in loss, even in absence, even in the soft return of a thing that once belonged to someone who never returned. Not all messages are written. Not all love is spoken. Some things are sent through sound, soft, low, ancient sound. Long before music was entertainment, it was a language. And long before people had words to explain how they felt, they picked up reeds, bones, shells, and turned them into flutes, into whistles, into drums. They carved holes into bird bones, stretched animal hide across wood, tied pebbles into hollow gourds. And with these, they spoke love, not directly, not in the way you're used to. No playlist, no mixtape, no romantic lyrics sent at 2 a.m. Just tone, rhythm, repetition. A certain note played twice meant, "I'm here." A low hum at dusk meant, "I miss you." The echo of a drum in the distance? That meant, "I haven't forgotten." You had to know the sound. You had to know who it belonged to. And you had to listen, not just with your ears, but with your memory. Imagine this. You're in a small village, just before twilight. The chores are done. The fire is lit. You're alone. But then, on the wind, you hear it. A high, familiar note from the hill beyond the trees. One long, one short. You freeze, because only one person plays it like that. And they're far away. But now, not that far, they've sent their sound to you. Not to knock on your door, not to ask for anything, but just to say, "I still remember." You wouldn't last a day with that kind of patience. You who send you up. You who skip songs after 15 seconds. You who get bored waiting for a voice message to finish. Back then, love came as sound. Slow, windblown, fading. Sometimes you didn't hear it clearly, but that was okay. You didn't need every note to be perfect. You just needed to know they played it for you. In many cultures, young lovers didn't speak aloud. They sent their feelings with melody. A certain flute melody meant, "I'm thinking of you." Another meant, "Meet me after the moon rises." Sometimes, entire relationships were built on these exchanges. One would play a tune in the early morning. The other would answer by drum that night. They never spoke. They didn't need to. They listened. They felt. When someone left, perhaps to another village or to war, they might teach someone else their melody. A sibling, a friend. If you pass through, play this near the tree line. If they hear it, they'll know it's from me. A traveling melody. A message carried not by words, but by breath. Even the wind was used. Some people would tie hollow reeds into tree branches, so that when the wind passed through, a certain tone would hum, a low, bending sound, like a sigh that never stopped. If your loved one walked by that tree, they would hear it, and they would know, because love didn't need to shout. It only needed to stir the air. Today, we schedule calls. We record voice notes. We leave voicemails no one listens to. But once, a single note, played right before sunset, was enough to change everything. They didn't have concerts. They had moments. Music wasn't for performance. It was for connection. Drums, too, were more than rhythm. A slow drum beat at midday might mean, "All is well." A rapid beat under moonlight might mean, "I'm waiting." You had to understand the patterns. And most importantly, you had to believe they were meant for you. Some people sang, not songs with words, just sounds. Humming while working, whistling near the river, And if the one they loved was close enough, they would hear it. They would pause, and they would hum back. A conversation, without words. Some flutes were made just for one person, crafted from reeds found on the day you first met, carved with a pattern only they'd recognize, tuned to match the way they breathed when they were happy. It wasn't for anyone else. It wasn't beautiful to everyone, but it was theirs. You wouldn't last a day with that kind of music. You who skip tracks and complain of buffering. You who search for meaning in lyrics written by strangers. They didn't need lyrics. They didn't need perfection. They just needed presence. And sound. Sometimes, music was all that remained. A flute found buried beside someone who never returned. A drum left behind, its hide stretched tight, still echoing when tapped. We find them now, in museums, behind glass, labeled as instrument origin unknown. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't an instrument. Maybe it was a love letter, played once, heard once, and never forgotten. Not all promises are made with clocks. Not all love is kept on a calendar. Once, people didn't say, "I'll see you at noon on the 12th. They said things like, "I'll return when the stars tilt north again," or "Find me when the red moon rises." Because long ago, love was timed not by hours, but by the sky, by the winds, by the ground itself. They made their promises in the language of the world, in nature, in rhythm, in return. You see, they had no watches, no countdowns. They didn't measure time by numbers, but by life. And so when they made a promise, especially a promise in love, it was rooted in something bigger, a tree blooming again, a constellation reappearing, the first frost after the last harvest. They might whisper, "I'll wait for you when the sun hangs low for 3 days." And the other would understand, the winter solstice, the longest night, a promise kept in darkness. Or they'd say, "When the swallows fly over the river again, I'll be standing where we met," because they knew the birds, they knew the river, they knew what returned and what didn't. Some lovers promised to meet when the rains come back, not knowing if they would, but believing in the water, believing in the rhythm of the land. They didn't need exact dates. They needed only faith in cycles. You wouldn't last a day with that kind of promise. You who set reminders for anniversaries, who panic if someone forgets the time, who cancel plans if the forecast changes. But once, a whole relationship could hang on a single sign, a moon, a flower, a certain star rising in the east. Some promises were tied to the earth. "I'll come back when the barley turns golden," or "when the snow melts off the northern ridge." People knew these signs the way we know traffic lights. They watched the land, listened to the soil, smelled the coming shift in seasons. And when the promised time came, they would go, even if they didn't know who would be waiting, even if they'd grown older, even if they'd almost given up. Because a promise, once spoken to the earth, wasn't taken lightly. Others looked up. The stars were their compass, their reminder, their witness. They marked the sky with memory. "This star is yours," they'd say. "When it shines bright again, I'll be on the road to find you." And so someone would wait. Not for a text, not for a knock, but for the sky to shift, for the heavens to signal that love might be returning. They trusted in the stars, not because they believed in magic, but because the stars always came back. Always. Even after the longest night. Some promised love through life itself. "When our children are grown, I will come to you again. When the harvest is good for 3 years straight, we'll marry. When I have earned enough wool for both of us to keep warm, I'll build our home." Their love was measured in milestones, not minutes. And when those milestones came, they kept their word, even if it took years, even if the world had changed. Because once, to love someone meant to anchor yourself in something greater, not just the person, but the sky above you both, the ground you both walked, the seasons that shaped your days. And if you failed to return, then the land would remember. The tree would bloom, waiting. The river would flow past the empty bank. The stars would rise, casting light on the one who kept watch. There was no blame, only sadness, only silence. But even that silence was sacred, because the promise had been real, and that was enough. Sometimes, archaeologists find marks on stones, circles carved near ancient wells. Not maps, not records, but messages, symbols of time, of waiting, of returning, lovers marking the moon's phases, or the path of Venus across the horizon, not for science, for love. So they would remember when to hope, so they would know when to look up. And sometimes the other person never returned. But still, they watched the stars. Still, they kept the promise. Still, they waited, because once, a vow tied to the sky was just as binding as any written oath, maybe more so. And in a world with no clocks, no rings, no contracts, what else could you give someone but your word, rooted in the turning of the earth? So, next time you make a promise, ask yourself, could you wait for the stars? Could you watch the land change, the winds shift, the moon grow full and then vanish, again and again, before you saw them again? Once, someone did. And once, someone kept their word, with nothing but starlight to guide them. Not every love letter is delivered. Not every message reaches the one it was meant for, and not every promise ends with reunion. But sometimes, even when the letter is never opened, even when the words are never heard, the message still remains, somewhere, buried, carved, forgotten, but not gone. In the ruins of Pompeii, archaeologists found walls covered in charcoal scrawl, names, notes, tiny fragments of life. One said, simply, "For her, I waited." No one knows who wrote it. No one knows if she ever saw it. But it's still there, written, remembered, preserved in ash and silence. And in that, a kind of love. You see, people have always left behind messages, even when they weren't sure anyone would ever read them. Even when they knew, deep down, that no one ever might. They still wrote. On stone, on clay, on bark, bone, skin, cave walls. Because the act of writing was sometimes more important than the reply. A young woman in Mesopotamia carved a small tablet, with markings only she and her beloved understood. She placed it under a basket of grain. He never came back. But centuries later, it was found, a quiet artifact of a heart that once waited. In Egypt, some tombs hold bundles of letters, not to kings, not to gods, but to loved ones who had passed. Wives wrote to husbands, mothers to daughters, words folded and buried in the earth, as if the dust might carry them into another world. No one read them at the time, but we read them now, and even now, they speak. A flute was found in the Andes. It was carved with a name. Nothing else, just a name. No one knows if it was played for joy or sorrow. No one knows if the one named ever heard it. But someone, long ago, held that flute and thought of love. You wouldn't last a day with that kind of message. You, who check for blue ticks. Who worry when your message says seen. Who delete what's unread after 3 days. Back then, they sent their hearts into the void, not knowing if there would ever be an answer. And still, they did it. Some letters were hidden in walls. Some were burned as offerings. Some were spoken aloud to rivers or mountains, because if the person couldn't hear, then maybe the land would carry the words for them. And sometimes, a message was sent, after it was too late. A soldier, gone to war, carves his wife's name into the handle of his blade. He never returns. But one day, the blade is found. Centuries later, and her name is still there. A mother loses her child to illness. She weaves a pattern into a blanket and leaves it at the temple steps. It is never claimed, but the blanket survives. Its threads hold grief and love woven tightly together. A boy carves the symbol of his heart into a tree. He leaves the town. He never comes back. But the tree stands for 400 more years, and the mark never fades. We find these things now. We dust them off. We label them. We put them in museums, behind glass. We say, tool, instrument, ritual object. But maybe they were letters. Maybe they were the last words someone never got to say. Maybe they were never meant to be found, but always meant to last. Because love doesn't need to be received. To be real, it just needs to be sent. Sometimes a message is written not for the person who receives it, but for the person who writes it, to hold a thought, to make something permanent, even when life isn't. And somehow, these messages survived. Through fire, through flood, through centuries of silence. A fragment of a song, a bit of thread tied in a certain way, a small stone carved with a single word. Wait, even the wind has carried messages. People used to speak into the breeze, believing that their breath might travel to the one they missed. Somehow, somewhere, the message would arrive. Not always in the way they expected. Not always in this lifetime. But somewhere, even now, we do this. We write letters we never send. We say voicemails we never replay. We stare at old photographs and say words no one will ever hear. And still, it means something, because love doesn't disappear just because no one reads the letter. It lingers, in ash, in paper, in memory, in ruins. There are letters in the ground, older than the pyramids, older than your oldest fears, and they still whisper. They say, I was here. I loved. I tried. I hoped. Maybe they were never opened, but they were never erased. So the next time you feel forgotten, the next time you write something and wonder if anyone will ever read it, remember, some of the deepest love stories never had an ending, only echoes. And sometimes, an echo is enough. And now, we have reached the end. Or perhaps, not the end, just the quiet place where all stories gently rest, where the dust settles, where the wind still carries echoes, where forgotten promises hum beneath the earth. We have traveled through a world without messages, without stamps, without timestamps or typing dots. A world without read receipts or countdowns or notifications. And yet, it was never truly silent, because even in the absence of words, there was still love. Steady, fragile, brave, a love that carved itself into stone, that whispered in reeds, that waited beside trees for seasons to turn, that sent a song into the hills, not to be answered, but simply to be heard. We forget, in this world of speed, how slow love used to be, how patient, how uncertain, how it required belief more than proof. To love, once, meant to trust that time would carry the message, that rivers would remember, that stars would return, that someone, somewhere, would still be listening. When the wind passed through a flute, or a pattern of knots swung quietly from a tree branch, we saw how they gave gifts, not for value, but for meaning. A carved shell, a broken pot, a woven ring of grass that said more than diamonds ever could. We learned how they measured time, not in minutes or hours, but in moons, in frost, in the breath of the land. And we followed them through loss, through war, through waiting that had no guarantee. We saw that some messages never arrived, but still mattered, still lasted, still lived. You might not last a day in their world. You, with your fast replies and blinking screens, with your need for certainty, with your fear of being left unread. But maybe, just maybe, you can take something with you. Maybe the next time you miss someone, you will walk outside and look at the stars. Maybe the next time you want to say something real, you will carve it into something that will outlive you. Maybe you will remember that love doesn't always need to be loud, or perfect, or instant. Sometimes, it only needs to be true. So rest now, with the sound of old flutes still drifting through your thoughts, with the image of hands carving symbols into stone, with the comfort of knowing that love, real love, can wait, can wander, can survive even if no one sees it. It does not vanish just because it isn't opened. It does not end just because it isn't answered. It stays in the soil, in the wind, in you, in the dusty countryside of 17th century New Spain, now known as Mexico. A girl was born who didn't quite belong anywhere. Her name was Juana Inés de la Cruz. She wasn't born into a noble family, nor a peasant one. She was the illegitimate daughter of a Creole captain and a woman of modest means. And in that time and place, being born out of wedlock meant you were already a step behind everyone else, especially if you were a girl. Juana had no official school to attend. In fact, girls weren't even expected to read. It was believed their hands should be more comfortable stirring stews than turning pages. But Juana was different. At just 3 years old, she taught herself to read by listening to lessons meant for her older sister. By the time she was 5, she was already writing little verses, crafting lines of poetry with a child's imagination and a scholar's precision. Since there was no classroom waiting for her, Juana created her own. Her grandfather's library became her secret world. She would sneak in when she could, borrowing books, as if they were treasures. Latin, Greek, philosophy, science, all written in languages and on topics she was never supposed to understand. But she read them anyway. She devoured them. She didn't need a teacher. The books themselves taught her how to think. She was so serious about her learning that, legend says, she once cut her hair short when she failed to memorize a lesson. To her, forgetting a passage wasn't just a mistake, it was a moral failing. Her hair, something that was so often used to define feminine beauty, became a kind of academic currency. If she didn't succeed in her studies, she would punish herself. In her mind, knowledge was sacred, almost religious. This was a girl who asked to dress as a boy so she could go to university. But society didn't allow that. Girls did not go to school. They were raised to marry, to bear children, and to obey. And Juana? Juana wanted to argue with Aristotle and debate theology with bishops. Still, in a world where obedience was prized above insight, Juana's curiosity refused to quiet down. When most children her age were memorizing prayers or chores, she was learning about metaphysics. She didn't just want to know what the world was, she wanted to know why it was, how it worked, where it was going. But imagine being a girl in that era, the air thick with incense from Sunday Mass, the walls of adobe homes covered in crucifixes, the heavy silence of a society that didn't want you to speak unless it was to serve. To read, to question, to write, these were not feminine things. And yet, Juana did all of them, alone and in secret. She wasn't rebellious in the loud way. She didn't scream. She didn't protest in the streets. Instead, she read. And in a society where a woman with an opinion was already a threat, a girl with a library in her head was downright dangerous. Her brilliance could not stay hidden for long. Word of her talent began to spread, like ink soaking through paper. But even then, many saw her not as a thinker, but as a novelty, something amusing, like a parrot that could recite scripture. A girl who reads? How charming, how unusual, but never how valuable. Still, Juana pressed on, reading under candlelight, translating Latin verses in her mind, imagining a world where a girl could study freely, without shame or ridicule. She didn't just hunger for knowledge, she burned for it. And if you, dear listener, think you could have done the same, think again. Imagine a world with no internet, no school, no encouragement, and every voice around you reminding you that your place is in the kitchen, not the library. Most wouldn't last a day. Sor Juana lasted a lifetime. By the time Juana Inés de la Cruz was a teenager, her brilliance had become impossible to ignore. She didn't come from noble blood, but her intellect was far too sharp to be hidden in the countryside. So, like many curiosities of her time, paintings, rare animals, musical instruments, she was brought to court. The viceroy and vicereine of New Spain had heard of the young girl who could quote Latin and write poetry, and they wanted to see for themselves. Juana, barely in her teens, was invited to the palace, but not to study. She wasn't offered a library or a tutor. Instead, she was placed among the ladies in waiting, like a decorative piece in a room full of chandeliers and silk. Her role was not that of a student. She was entertainment. They didn't ask her what she wanted to learn, they asked her to perform. She was given riddles to solve, questions to answer, poems to recite, all while noblemen and scholars looked on, amused. At one point, it's said that she was tested by a panel of 40 men. Not for any official title, but simply for sport. They wanted to see if this young girl could outwit them, or if her so-called genius was just a parlor trick. And Juana? She outwitted them all. She answered every question. She debated with logic, precision, and wit. Her responses weren't rehearsed. They were spontaneous, dazzling, and unsettling to the men who had expected her to stumble. But did it earn her a place among them? Did anyone offer to help her study, to join their ranks? Number. Instead, they applauded, they laughed, they marveled, but only the way one marvels at a circus act. She had passed their test, but there was no reward. In a world where women were meant to be quiet, decorative, and obedient, Juana had broken the mold, and rather than being welcomed into intellectual circles, she was treated like a strange exception, something to be admired, then dismissed. Even when she succeeded, society gently, and sometimes not so gently, reminded her she was still a girl. And girls, no matter how smart, belonged in the kitchen, not the library, not the study, not the university. One bishop reportedly told her, "You would do better to spin than to write." Spinning thread was, apparently, more acceptable than spinning thoughts. Her intellect became a kind of warning. People respected it, but also feared it. A woman who knew too much was dangerous. What might she say? What might she question? What if she began to think not just about books, but about justice? So, Juana had to walk a tightrope. She learned how to soften her answers, to smile while correcting a nobleman's mistake, to pretend her poems were mere pastimes, not philosophy in disguise. All while absorbing everything, science, literature, theology, like a sponge hidden behind a lace curtain. But imagine that for a moment. Imagine being told that your brain is only valuable when it entertains others. That your talent exists, not for your own growth, but for the amusement of those who will never treat you as an equal. Imagine being the smartest person in the room, but only being allowed to speak when spoken to. Most people wouldn't last a day. Sor Juana lasted years. She performed. She played their game. But not because she wanted applause. She played it to survive, to stay close to knowledge, to keep her mind sharp while waiting for a space where she could finally think and write in peace. And perhaps that's what makes her brilliance so remarkable. Not just that she was intelligent, but that she was intelligent in spite of everything that tried to make her feel small. Every compliment was a dismissal in disguise. Every test passed was followed by a door politely closed. And yet, she stayed standing. In time, Juana would find a way out, but not by joining a university or publishing books freely. No, the only place a woman could think without constant interruption was behind stone walls in a convent. That was her next chapter. But here, in the gilded court of New Spain, Juana had already learned one of life's hardest truths. Some people won't care how smart you are if you don't come in the right package. And even now, centuries later, that still rings true. In the 17th century, options for a woman like Juana Inés de la Cruz were painfully limited. If you were brilliant, curious, and female, you had exactly two choices: marry and become silent, or join a convent and become slightly less silent. Juana chose the latter. She didn't become a nun out of piety alone. In fact, she once said openly that she had no particular desire to marry Christ, but she longed for something rarer than love or devotion. She wanted time. She wanted space. She wanted, most dangerously of all, books. And in those days, the convent was the only acceptable place where a woman could access knowledge without scandal. Not a university, not a salon, not even a private library. Just stone walls, strict schedules, and the occasional blessed silence. So, Juana put on the habit, not because she was fleeing the world, but because it was the only way to stay close to what she truly loved, learning. She joined the convent of San Geronimo in Mexico City. It wasn't glamorous. Her cell wasn't large, but she filled it with books, hundreds of them, and not just books, scientific instruments, musical scores, letters, poems, treatises. She learned Latin and Greek fluently. She taught herself philosophy and theology. She wrote essays, plays, and even composed music. Some said she had the most impressive private library in the New World. In that little room, Juana created a kind of secret university, for one. But even in the convent, she wasn't completely safe from criticism. Some saw her studies as prideful. A woman who read too much, they warned, would grow arrogant. And arrogance? In a nun? Unthinkable. Still, Juana persisted. She read not for fame, not for power, but because her mind simply wouldn't sit still. She believed deeply that women had the right to know, to think, to write. That silence was not a virtue, but a punishment. That obedience was not wisdom. She once wrote, "I do not study to teach others, but to better understand the truth." In her view, truth was not owned by men or priests or kings. It belonged to anyone brave enough to seek it. Of course, the church didn't quite agree. But for a time, they let her be. Perhaps because she was charming. Perhaps because her poetry was beautiful. Or perhaps because they underestimated her. After all, what harm could a nun do, locked away with her books? A lot, as it turned out. Juana's writings began to reach beyond the convent walls. Her poetry circulated through Mexico City, then across the ocean to Spain. Her plays were performed, her essays praised. Even royalty admired her wit. She became, quite accidentally, famous. But she never left the convent, not because she couldn't, but because it was the only place that allowed her to exist on her own terms, even if only slightly. The outside world still judged her, still whispered about her, still raised eyebrows when she dared to write about passion, or criticize hypocrisy, or question men's logic. And yet, she stayed at her desk, day after day, night after night, candle flickering, ink drying, page by page. She built a legacy not in marble or stained glass, but in paper and ideas. Most people would not have lasted a week in that cell. No comfort, no praise, no real freedom. But Juana made it a sanctuary, because even with the limits placed on her, it was more freedom than any woman could ask for at the time. No parties, no husband, no royal titles, just silence, books, and the quiet rebellion of a woman who refused to stop thinking. So, the next time you complain about your Wi-Fi being slow, remember Sor Juana. She gave up everything: comfort, companionship, safety, just to read in peace, just to think, just to be. And somehow, in a world that told her she wasn't allowed, she found a way to know everything. You might think that once Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz became a nun, her life settled quietly into prayer and silence. After all, what could be more uneventful than a cloistered life behind convent walls? Well, quite a bit, actually. Because while many expected Sor Juana to retire into religious obedience, she did something rather unexpected. She wrote poetry. Beautiful, emotional, lyrical poetry. And not the dry, dutiful verses about angels and saints that you might expect from a 17th century nun. No. Sor Juana wrote love poems, and not always to men. This was unusual. Her poems were passionate, playful, intimate. Some lines throbbed with longing, others glowed with admiration. And while some were written in the more acceptable direction, man to woman, woman to God, a number of them were addressed, quite clearly, to women. One woman in particular appears frequently in her poems: Maria Luisa Manrique de Lara y Gonzaga, the Countess of Paredes, and wife of the Viceroy. A noble woman, a patron, and, perhaps, something more. Juana called her Lycie in her verses, a name veiled just enough to be poetic, but close enough to raise eyebrows. She praised Lycie's beauty, her mind, her presence. She described the pain of absence, the joy of closeness. She called her muse, her light, her inspiration. In one poem, Juana writes, "I love you with such passion, no soul can hold it," which, for a nun sworn to chastity, was bold. Now, historians have debated for centuries what these poems really meant. Some say it was simply poetic convention. Others argue it was the only socially acceptable way for a woman to express deep emotional bonds in a time when friendships between women were one of the few outlets for feeling. But still, Sor Juana's verses weren't exactly subtle, and whether or not they were romantic in the modern sense, they were certainly intimate. They recognized women as worthy of poetic adoration. They elevated female affection from the margins to the center of the page. In a world where women were mostly written about, Sor Juana dared to write to them. This didn't go unnoticed. Writing love poetry as a nun was already risky. Writing it to another woman? That was something else entirely. And yet, Sor Juana continued, quietly, persistently, elegantly. She turned the tools of literature into quiet rebellion. Because, truthfully, poetry was her safest weapon. She couldn't march. She couldn't protest. She couldn't stand in the pulpit or the university. But she could write a sonnet. She could choose every syllable with precision. She could embed critique and emotion in perfect meter and rhyme. And poetry, unlike debate, didn't demand permission. Even so, the content of her work unsettled the powerful. Her poetry blurred lines between sacred and secular, between devotion and desire, between female obedience and female voice. Every poem was a quiet act of defiance dressed in metaphor, because what could be more medieval than a nun who not only read but felt? Her writing reminds us that love, in all its forms, isn't confined by titles or gender or vows. And even if her poems never mentioned names outright, they spoke loudly enough to echo across centuries. So if you're imagining a quiet, obedient nun scribbling gentle hymns in a candlelit room, think again. Sor Juana was crafting verses that made bishops nervous. She wrote with elegance, yes, but also with courage. And let's be honest, most of us today might still hesitate to publish certain feelings in public. Imagine doing it in the 1600s. As a nun, in a colony, under the watchful eyes of the church. Most of us wouldn't last a day. Sor Juana lasted decades. She didn't just write to be heard. She wrote because silence wasn't an option. Her poetry wasn't rebellion with a shout, it was resistance with a whisper. And those whispers? Still audible today. By now, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz was not just a nun with a personal library. She was a writer, a poet, a thinker, and, quietly but firmly, a rebel. Her rebellion wasn't loud. It didn't involve torches or speeches or marches. No, Sor Juana's rebellion came in verse, measured, rhymed, and razor sharp. She used poetry the way some people use a sword. And her most famous poem? A full-on satirical takedown of male hypocrisy. Its title translates loosely to, "You foolish men," which, even by 17th century standards, was not exactly subtle. In this poem, Sor Juana does what few women of her time dared. She calls out the illogical, self-serving behavior of men, especially how they judge women. Here's the basic argument, in rhyme of course. Men seduce women, then blame them for being seduced. They demand purity, but chase pleasure. They expect silence, but punish dullness. They want women to be clever, but only in ways that serve them. They shame women for falling in love, and for not falling in love. And somehow, they never see the contradiction. The tone is sharp, but not angry. It's patient, precise. The kind of calm that makes the insult sting even more. She doesn't scream. She doesn't accuse. She just lays out the facts and lets the contradictions speak for themselves. It's not just poetry, it's strategy. Because Sor Juana understood something crucial. When you live in a world that punishes women for speaking plainly, the only safe way to be honest is to be poetic. And her satire wasn't just clever, it was necessary, because, in truth, she was surrounded by these double standards every day. As a woman who read, who wrote, who questioned, she was constantly walking the edge of what was acceptable. If she had delivered these ideas in a sermon or a pamphlet, she would have been silenced instantly. But as a poem? Well, that could be dismissed as just verse, just imagination, just a nun writing with flair. Of course, it wasn't just anything. Her verses landed like quiet thunder in salons and libraries. People read them, recited them, debated them. Some nodded in agreement, others squirmed. She was telling the truth, and that always makes someone uncomfortable. Sor Juana didn't just write about love, or God, or longing. She wrote about injustice, about the mental traps women were placed in, about how society set up rules that couldn't be followed, and then punished women for breaking them. And what made her work even more brilliant was how she delivered it with grace. Her words were elegant, her tone refined. You could almost miss the bite until it was already under your skin. Take this line, for instance. "You foolish men who lay the guilt on women, not seeing you're the cause of the very thing you blame." That's not just a verse, that's a mirror. And perhaps most impressive of all, she made it rhyme. But it wasn't just about men. Sor Juana's true target was bigger. It was the system, the expectations, the traditions that caged women and called it virtue. She saw how women were shamed into silence, how their intelligence was mocked or ignored, and how obedience was considered the highest form of femininity. She didn't rant, she rhymed. Because when shouting isn't allowed, rhythm becomes resistance. Now, let's pause for a moment. Imagine being a woman in the 1600s, in a Spanish colony, under church authority, and writing this kind of poem. Imagine knowing your words could upset bishops, scholars, and nobles, and choosing to write them anyway. Most of us wouldn't last a week. Sor Juana, she kept going. Her pen wasn't just clever, it was brave. And though she often cloaked her critiques in classical references and poetic form, the message was always clear. Women are not the problem. The rules are. So the next time someone calls poetry soft or frivolous, remember Sor Juana. She wrote with ink, but it struck like iron. Her poems didn't just rhyme, they revealed. And centuries later, we're still reading them, still feeling the sting. Still hearing the voice of a nun who refused to be quiet, and instead turned every double standard into a perfect line of verse. For years, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz lived a quiet, powerful kind of rebellion. In her convent cell, she read, she wrote. She studied Latin, theology, astronomy, music, logic, and history. She wrote poetry that poked at power, plays that entertained and educated, essays that questioned traditions. She didn't preach in the streets. She didn't lead any revolutions. She just kept reading. But in 17th century New Spain, that alone was dangerous. The church, of course, was watching. At first, Sor Juana's talents were tolerated, even praised. She was seen as a curiosity, a unique jewel in the Spanish colonies. Her poetry delighted nobles. Her plays entertained viceroys. She was clever, yes, but also cloistered, and that made her seem manageable, until she started asking too many questions, until her learning no longer stayed within the safe subjects, until she began writing about injustice, inequality, and, most threatening of all, the idea that women, too, had a right to know things. That's when the praise stopped. Church officials began to murmur that she was too proud, that she read too much, that she wrote too boldly, that her ideas were becoming problematic. And when a woman's mind becomes a problem, it doesn't take long for someone to decide that she must be corrected. The attack didn't come with swords, it came with words. In 1690, a bishop from Puebla, one of the most powerful figures in the Mexican church, published a letter criticizing Sor Juana for her writings, but he didn't do it honestly. Instead, he used a false name, pretending to be a woman named Sor Filotea de la Cruz, a fellow nun offering sisterly advice. In the letter, Sor Filotea praised Juana's intelligence and then scolded her. She implied that Sor Juana was wasting her talents, that women should avoid scholarly pride, that it would be better for her soul if she stuck to religious reading and left theology to the men. It was a polite slap in the face, wrapped in piety. But Sor Juana didn't stay silent. She wrote back, not with rage, but with calm, clear brilliance. Her response, now known as the reply to Sor Filotea, is one of the most famous feminist texts in Latin American history. In it, she explained her love of learning, defended her right to study, and gently but firmly challenged the idea that knowledge was dangerous in the hands of a woman. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending the idea that women are capable of deep thought, that curiosity isn't a sin, that God, if he gave her a mind like this, surely didn't mean for her to let it rot. Her tone was humble, but her message was revolutionary. Of course, humility wasn't enough. The church was growing impatient. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Officials told Sor Juana she was disobedient, arrogant, too visible, too admired. They insisted she give up her studies, stop writing, be the quiet, obedient nun she was supposed to be. She resisted, for a while, but eventually the pressure became unbearable. Faced with the weight of the church, with public criticism and private warnings, with threats to her safety and her community, Sor Juana gave in. She signed a formal declaration, apologizing for her errors. She promised to stop writing. She sold her beloved library. She gave away her scientific instruments. She stopped putting ink to paper. To some, it looked like defeat. A brilliant woman, silenced. But others see it differently. They see a woman who survived, who knew when to retreat so that her words would live on, who understood that survival, too, is a form of resistance, that sometimes surrender is strategic. She had already said what needed to be said. Her poems had already escaped the convent walls. Her letters, her verses, her arguments, those couldn't be taken back. They were already out there, breathing in the world. Even if she stopped writing, the silence was not empty. It was full of everything she had written before. And so, the nun who once stunned scholars with her wit, who wrote love poems and philosophical treatises and biting satire, now sat quietly in a convent that no longer felt like a sanctuary. She went silent, but her words did not. At first, the convent had been a sanctuary. For Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, it was the one place in 17th century New Spain where she could think, write, and read. Without constant interruption, she had chosen the habit not for religious ecstasy, but for intellectual survival. Behind its thick stone walls, she found the time and space to grow her mind like a quiet garden. But gardens do not stay untouched forever. As the years passed, that peaceful garden became a battlefield. By the 1690s, Sor Juana was no longer just the talented nun with a love of learning. She had become a public figure, a symbol, a voice. And for some, that voice had grown too loud. Her poetry questioned men's logic. Her essays examined theology. Her satire poked holes in hypocrisy. And worst of all, she made people think about women, about power, about truth. That made her dangerous. Outside the convent, critics stirred. Inside, pressure mounted. The church had already warned her once, through the false Sor Philotea letter. She had responded eloquently, yes, but her response only deepened the concern. A nun who could argue with bishops was not a nun they could control. And so, the quiet attacks began. There were no grand accusations, no dramatic trials. Instead, there were whispers, looks, hints, dropped like pebbles into still water. Warnings cloaked in concern. Sister Juana, perhaps you should pray more and read less. Suggestions that her studies were prideful, that her writings were unbecoming, that the devil could enter through even the most beautiful lines of poetry. What had once been a cell filled with books now felt like a room under surveillance. And Sor Juana, who had once written freely of love and logic, began to question herself, not because she believed she had done wrong, but because the weight of silence was pressing in on all sides. The same pen that had once brought her freedom now felt like it carried risk with every stroke. Eventually, the pressure broke through. She did what no one expected from the woman who had fought so long, so brilliantly, to keep her voice. She stopped writing. She gave up her library. She sold her books, her instruments, her notes, years of study, given away like ashes. She signed a confession, a formal act of penance, admitting she had been prideful, promising to obey, promising to be still. To some, it looked like she had surrendered. To others, it looked like survival. Because Sor Juana knew how power worked. She had studied its movements like a mathematician. She understood that even in silence, there is strategy. That sometimes, to keep a little of yourself, you have to give a little away. So yes, she fell quiet. But it was not the quiet of defeat. It was the quiet of someone who had already said what needed to be said. The battlefield, by then, was not public, it was internal. She stayed in the convent. But it no longer felt like refuge. The walls had grown closer, the eyes sharper. Her thoughts still bloomed, but she could no longer let them reach the page. Her silence wasn't peaceful. It was a kind of grief. And yet, even in retreat, she never lost her dignity. Those who lived with her said she continued to help the poor, that she taught music, that she comforted the sick. In her final years, she turned her mind towards service, pouring her restless brilliance into compassion instead of prose. And when a plague swept through the convent in 1695, Sor Juana did not hide. She cared for the sick herself. She held hands. She prayed. She stayed close, even when it was dangerous. She died that same year, likely from the illness she had risked her life to fight. There was no grand funeral, no public tribute, just silence. But her words lived on, because silence cannot erase ink. And the nun who once turned her convent into a sanctuary of books, then into a battleground of spirit, had already made her mark, far beyond those stone walls. When Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz died in 1695, there were no grand speeches, no statues were built, no bells were rung across cities. She passed quietly, within the same convent walls that had once been her sanctuary, and later her cage. She had fallen silent years before, under the pressure of the church, forced to stop writing, studying, and speaking out. But something strange happened. Her words didn't die with her. They drifted beyond the convent gates, carried by those who had read her poems, heard her ideas, and quietly passed them on. Her verses were copied, shared, sent across oceans. Some were hidden in drawers, others studied in candlelit corners, in Spain, in New Spain. In places she never visited, her thoughts began to live new lives. Because Sor Juana's true legacy wasn't just what she wrote, it was the spirit behind it. She had written about love, knowledge, injustice, faith, reason, longing. She had written about being a woman in a world built for men. But more than that, she had written as if she had the right to. That was what truly lingered. Her legacy was the quiet but radical idea that a woman's mind mattered. That women could think deeply, ask hard questions, and write boldly, not in secret, not in apology, but in full view. That curiosity wasn't a sin, and silence wasn't a virtue. That to learn was not to rebel, but to live. In many ways, her legacy was too big for her own time. For over a century after her death, her name faded from public memory. Her books were hard to find. Her life was simplified, just a clever nun who wrote poetry. It was safer that way, easier to admire her talent while ignoring what she actually stood for. But history has a way of circling back. In the 20th century, feminist scholars began to rediscover Sor Juana's works. They saw more than pretty verses. They saw courage, complexity, fire. They recognized a woman centuries ahead of her time. A woman who had pushed against limits, not with violence, but with verbs. And today, in Latin America and beyond, Sor Juana is no longer a footnote. She is studied in schools. Her poems are set to music. Her essays are taught in philosophy classes. Her face even appears on the Mexican 200 peso bill. Not as a saint, not just as a poet, but as an icon of intellectual freedom. She's been called the first feminist of the Americas, a title she never claimed, but likely would have smiled at. Because Sor Juana never said, "I speak for all women." She simply refused to stop speaking, and that refusal has inspired generations. Writers, students, teachers, and thinkers, especially women, have found strength in her story, in the idea that you don't need permission to be intelligent, that even if no one listens, it's still worth saying what's in your mind. And for those who still live in societies where women's voices are questioned, or silenced, or ignored, Sor Juana is more than a historical figure. She's proof. Proof that one quiet voice, in one quiet room, can echo for centuries. Because what she left behind wasn't just a body of work, it was a way of being. A spirit of resilience, of defiance without rage, of softness without surrender. She had once said, "I do not study in order to teach, but to lessen my own ignorance." In that single sentence, she revealed her deepest truth, that knowledge is a human right, not a gendered privilege. And so today, her words live on, in libraries, in classrooms, in the whispered confidence of young writers who still feel like they're not supposed to take up space. in the tired but determined gaze of women who are told to know their place and think quietly. I already do. Her poetry still shines, but her greatest legacy is invisible. It's the permission she gave, by example, to question, to learn, to think. Even if it takes centuries for the world to understand, if you walk through the ruins of old convents in Mexico City today, you may find crumbling walls, faint echoes, the scent of dust and time. But somewhere, in the silence between the stones, there is still a whisper, a trace of ink, a presence that didn't vanish when her body did. It's Sor Juana, not in marble or gold, not in stained glass or stone, but in the quiet legacy of thought, of refusal, of light. She never screamed, she never rioted, she never led a rebellion. And yet, her life was one long, steady defiance, like a small candle, lit quietly in a dark room, not to attract attention, but simply because there was no light, and someone had to start. Her world didn't burn her at the stake. It didn't imprison her in chains. It didn't call her a witch. It did something quieter, perhaps more chilling. It tried to praise her into silence, to smile while taking away her books, to pat her head and ask her not to think so much. It told her, be brilliant, but not too bold. Be clever, but not critical. Be obedient, always. And she said, number, not with shouts, but with syllables. Not with violence, but with verse. She did what her time told her not to do. She wrote. She studied. She questioned. She expressed love, frustration, philosophy, grief, desire. And she did it all, as a woman, in a church, in a world that told her to keep her head down and her hands folded. There were things she could not say, things no woman could say, not safely, but she found ways to write them anyway, in poetry, in metaphor, in satire, in sweetness. She slid truth into rhythm, hid rebellion behind rhyme, and the result? A record of thought that still feels alive. Sor Juana's life was not one of sweeping drama. It was not filled with crowns or armies or epic scenes. It was filled with quiet moments, with pages turning, with candles burning low, with a pen scratching late into the night, with a woman staring at the stars, wondering, thinking, aching for more. But it's exactly that quiet that made her powerful. Because her time couldn't say it aloud, that women are more than vessels, more than wives, more than obedient daughters of the church, that women could know things, want things, question things, and not be punished for it. Her time didn't say that, so she did. Quietly, carefully, in careful Spanish and careful Latin, in lines that sometimes rhymed and sometimes refused to. And like a candle in a room full of fog, her light didn't blind, it revealed. It showed the unevenness of a world that feared female minds. It showed the cruelty hidden in custom, the silence buried inside tradition, the power of a woman who simply wouldn't stop thinking, even when they told her to, especially then. Today, we remember Sor Juana not just because she was brilliant, not just because she was ahead of her time, but because she was willing to live exactly as herself in a time that said she shouldn't exist at all. And maybe that's the hardest thing of all, to be fully who you are when the world keeps whispering that it would be easier for everyone if you were something else, someone quieter, simpler, safer. But Sor Juana lit her candle anyway. She didn't shine like lightning. She didn't explode like fire. She glowed, steady, soft, stubborn, and that glow is still with us. It flickers in the hearts of girls who stay up reading under the covers, in the fingers of students writing papers no one expects them to write, in the voices of women asking questions that make the room uncomfortable. Her candle was never meant to be the only one. It was meant to be the first. By now, you've heard the story, not of a warrior or a queen, but of a woman with a mind too restless to stay quiet. A girl born without wealth or legitimacy, who taught herself to read before she knew the world wouldn't approve. A nun who didn't choose the convent out of piety, but out of desperation, for peace, for books, for the right to think. And she did think, boldly, quietly, relentlessly. In a world built to quiet her, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz found the one thing no one could take away: her words. She used them to question double standards, to explore love and logic, to challenge the church, not with fire, but with finesse. When they warned her that reading too much would ruin her soul, she replied with essays and satire. When they told her to repent, she wrote a letter so measured, so eloquent, it still echoes centuries later. Eventually, the silence caught up with her. She was pressured to stop writing, to destroy her books, to become obedient, at last. And so, she stopped, but history didn't. The pages she filled outlived the pressure. The thoughts she dared to put into ink could not be burned. She was forgotten for a time, pushed to the margins like so many women before her, but she came back. Or rather, her ideas did. Today, Sor Juana stands as something far greater than just a poet or a nun. She is a symbol of intellectual resistance. A reminder that knowledge is not always loud, but it is always powerful. That sometimes, the most radical thing a person can do is think for themselves and refuse to apologize for it. And if you're wondering why this matters now, centuries later, it's simple. Because the questions she asked are still with us. Because the doors she knocked on still don't open easily. Because the world still, too often, tells women to be quiet and calls it kindness. Sor Juana didn't shout. She whispered. But her whisper was strong enough to bend the future. Most people wouldn't last a day in her world, but she lasted long enough to change ours. So if, tonight, you're listening to this before sleep, let it be more than a story. Let it be a soft reminder that knowledge is worth seeking, that silence isn't always peace, and that even a single candle can light a path no one else dared walk.